Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." The slap echoed through the marble courthouse plaza like a gunshot, and Judge Rachel Montgomery's head snapped sideways so hard that legal documents scattered like confetti across the Atlanta federal courthouse steps. Hayes grabbed her by the throat, slamming her back against the stone wall with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. Metal handcuffs bit into her wrists as he twisted her arms behind her back. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The bronze nameplate above the Atlanta Federal Courthouse entrance gleamed in the October morning sun. The Honorable Judge R. Montgomery presiding. 20 feet below, Judge Rachel Montgomery walked up the courthouse steps in dark jeans and a bright emerald sweater, her leather briefcase containing today's case files. She preferred arriving early, reviewing her docket in the quiet before the storm of legal proceedings. Rachel had earned her seat on the federal bench through 15 years of relentless advocacy, fighting discrimination cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. At 38, she was the youngest federal judge in Georgia's Northern District, and the first black woman to preside over major civil rights cases in Atlanta. Her morning ritual included coffee from the corner deli, a walk through Centennial Olympic Park, and arriving at her courthouse dressed like any other citizen. She climbed the marble steps, mentally reviewing the day ahead. 3 sentencing hearings, 2 motion arguments, and a preliminary injunction hearing in a housing discrimination case. Rachel thrived on the intellectual challenge, the careful balance of law and justice that her position demanded. But across the plaza, Officer Derek Hayes saw something entirely different. Hayes leaned against his patrol car, scanning the courthouse entrance with predatory eyes. 23 years on the Atlanta police force had taught him to spot trouble, and in his mind, trouble had a very specific look. He watched the woman in jeans approach the courthouse, noting her casual dress, her confident stride, the expensive briefcase that didn't match what he assumed about her background. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in," he muttered to himself, crushing his cigarette under his boot. Hayes had built his career on assumptions like these. 3 commendations for exemplary community policing. 15 formal complaints buried in departmental files. A reputation among his fellow officers as someone who kept the streets clean through methods that never appeared in official reports. He saw the courthouse as his domain, where he decided who belonged and who didn't. The woman climbed the steps with purpose, but Hayes moved to intercept her path. He positioned himself directly in front of the entrance, arms crossed, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the marble. "Hold it right there," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Rachel looked up, confused. She recognized Hayes from courthouse security briefings but had never interacted with him directly. Something in his posture, the way his eyes narrowed as she approached, sent warning signals through her mind. "Excuse me," Rachel said, adjusting her grip on the briefcase. "You can't just walk into a federal courthouse looking like that," Hayes sneered, his gaze moving dismissively from her casual clothes to her face. "This isn't the welfare office." The words hit Rachel like ice water. She had faced racism throughout her career, but never this brazen, this public, this close to her own courtroom. She took a breath, keeping her voice steady. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I work here." Hayes laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the courthouse walls. "Work here? Doing what? Cleaning toilets?" Before Rachel could respond, Hayes stepped closer, invading her personal space. His hand moved to his belt, fingers drumming against his baton with practiced menace. "Let me see some identification," he demanded. Rachel reached for her purse, but Hayes grabbed her wrist with crushing force. "Slowly," he hissed. "No sudden movements." The briefcase slipped from Rachel's other hand as Hayes twisted her arm. Legal documents scattered across the courthouse steps like confetti, case files and judicial orders mixing with fallen autumn leaves. Rachel winced as his grip tightened, but her eyes remained fixed on the bronze nameplate above the entrance. 20 feet from her own courtroom, being brutalized by the very system she served. "Officer Hayes, if you'll just let me explain," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the pain shooting through her wrist. The use of his name stopped Hayes cold. How did she know who he was? His paranoia flared, mixing with his anger to create something dangerous. How do you know my name? He demanded, his free hand moving to his weapon. I've seen you in the courthouse, Rachel said carefully. I really do work here. If you'll just let me show you my identification. But Hayes was beyond listening. In his mind, this woman represented everything he hated about the changing world around him. Federal judges who sided with criminals over cops. Civil rights lawyers who made careers out of destroying good officers. A system that was forgetting who the real heroes were. His open palm cracked against Rachel's face so hard her head snapped sideways. The slap echoed through the marble courthouse plaza like a gunshot. Rachel staggered, her cheek burning, tasting blood where her teeth cut into her lip. The expensive briefcase had scattered its contents completely now, federal case files blowing across the courthouse steps in the October wind. Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses, Hayes snarled, grabbing Rachel by the throat. He slammed her back against the stone wall with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. Rachel's vision blurred as his fingers closed around her windpipe, cutting off her oxygen. She clawed at his hands, but Hayes was too strong, too angry, too convinced of his own righteousness. Derek, what the hell are you doing? Officer Carlos Rodriguez approached from the parking garage, having witnessed the assault from across the plaza. But instead of intervening, he pulled out his phone and began recording. Just another criminal trying to breach courthouse security, Hayes called over his shoulder, never loosening his grip on Rachel's throat. Help me get her in cuffs. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then moved to assist. He had seen Hayes cross lines before, but this felt different. More vicious. More personal. Hayes twisted Rachel's arms behind her back, metal handcuffs biting into her wrists with deliberate cruelty. Her emerald sweater was torn now, stained with dirt from the courthouse wall. The purple bruise was already forming across her left cheek. Other officers began gathering, drawn by the commotion. Some laughed nervously. Others recorded with their phones, already calculating how they would frame the narrative. Officer Janet Thompson watched from the courthouse entrance, her hand resting on her radio, but she made no move to call for backup or supervisors. This was how the system worked. Officers protected officers. The story would be simple. Aggressive suspect resists arrest. Officer uses appropriate force to maintain courthouse security. Have you ever seen instant karma this brutal? Hayes muttered, dragging Rachel toward the courthouse entrance. But he had no idea that karma was still loading. Hayes dragged Rachel through the courthouse entrance, her handcuffed wrists scraping against the marble doorframe. The metal detectors beeped frantically as they passed through, but the security guards waved them forward without question. They knew Hayes. They knew his methods. They had learned not to ask questions. The courthouse lobby stretched before them like a cathedral of justice, its vaulted ceilings and polished floors echoing with the morning bustle of lawyers, clerks, and citizens seeking their day in court. But Rachel saw it all through a haze of pain and disbelief. Her left cheek throbbed where Hayes had struck her, and her throat burned from his chokehold. Keep moving, Hayes commanded, shoving her forward toward the elevator bank. Rachel's mind raced as they walked. She knew these hallways better than her own home. 3rd floor, Courtroom 312, where she had presided over hundreds of cases. 2nd floor, chambers where she spent her evenings reading briefs and crafting careful judicial opinions. 1st floor, where federal marshals typically handled courthouse security, not local police officers like Hayes. But the marshals were nowhere to be seen this morning. Budget cuts had reduced their presence to essential hearings only, leaving routine security to Atlanta police officers like Hayes who viewed the courthouse as an extension of the streets they patrolled. Where are you taking me? Rachel asked, her voice hoarse from the assault. Somewhere you can think about your choices, Hayes replied, pressing the elevator button with unnecessary force. Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably beside them. He had been on the force for 8 years, long enough to recognize when a situation was spinning out of control. The woman in custody looked professional despite her casual clothes. Her briefcase had contained legitimate legal documents, and the way she carried herself, even in handcuffs, suggested someone familiar with courtroom proceedings. Derek, Rodriguez said quietly as the elevator doors opened. Maybe we should check her identification first. Make sure we're following protocol. Hayes whirled on his colleague with blazing eyes. Protocol. Carlos, this woman tried to breach federal courthouse security. She became combative when questioned. She's lucky I didn't shoot her for threatening a police officer. The elevator rose slowly toward the second floor, where temporary holding cells were located adjacent to the main courtrooms. Rachel watched the floor numbers illuminate, each one carrying her further from the salvation of her own chambers, her own nameplate, her own authority. But Hayes wasn't finished asserting his dominance. You know what your problem is, he said, turning to face Rachel in the confined elevator space. You people think the rules don't apply to you. Think because some liberal judge gave you a welfare check, you can just waltz into federal buildings like you own the place. Rachel bit back her response. Everything in her legal training screamed to assert her rights, to demand proper procedure, to invoke her judicial authority. But something deeper held her back. A survival instinct honed by years of navigating systemic racism told her that revealing her identity now might escalate Hayes's violence to lethal levels. She had seen the cases. Black judges threatened by white supremacists. Federal officials targeted for assassination. Sometimes hiding in plain sight was the only way to survive long enough for truth to emerge. The elevator doors opened to reveal the second-floor corridor, lined with temporary holding cells used for defendants awaiting hearings. Hayes marched Rachel toward cell 3, the same cell where she had ordered countless defendants to await their turns before her bench. Enjoy your stay, Hayes said, unlocking the cell door with a key ring that jangled like chains. I'll be back to collect you for your hearing. He shoved Rachel inside with enough force to send her stumbling toward the concrete bench that served as the cell's only furniture. The metal door clanged shut with finality, and Hayes twisted the lock with obvious satisfaction. Don't go anywhere, he laughed at his own joke, Rodriguez forcing a weak smile beside him. Rachel sat on the cold concrete bench, her handcuffed wrists making it impossible to find a comfortable position. The cell was exactly as she remembered from her monthly inspections. 8 feet by 6 feet, fluorescent lighting that hummed with electrical interference, a toilet that hadn't been cleaned in days. But now she experienced it from the other side. The claustrophobic walls seemed to press inward. The chemical smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with human despair. The constant noise from the courthouse's HVAC system that she had never noticed from her chambers above. Rachel closed her eyes and tried to center herself. 15 years of legal practice had taught her that emotion was the enemy of clear thinking. Right now, she needed strategy more than anger, planning more than rage. Hayes had made several critical errors that would unravel his fabricated narrative. He had assaulted her in full view of courthouse security cameras. He had failed to follow proper identification procedures. He had used excessive force against someone who posed no threat. And most importantly, he had no idea who he was dealing with. But first, she had to survive whatever came next. Down the corridor, Hayes was already constructing his version of events. He pulled out his incident report form and began writing with practiced ease, his pen moving across the paper like a novelist crafting fiction. Subject: unidentified black female, approximately 35 years old, attempting to breach courthouse security. Subject was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings and carrying suspicious materials. When approached for routine questioning, subject became verbally aggressive and physically combative. Rodriguez watched over Hayes's shoulder, growing more uncomfortable with each fabricated detail. Derek, what if someone reviews the security footage? Hayes looked up from his report with cold confidence. Carlos, you've been doing this job for 8 years. When have you ever seen anyone review security footage for a simple disorderly conduct arrest? The system protects good cops who do their jobs. He continued writing, his narrative becoming more elaborate with each sentence. Subject claimed to be a lawyer and demanded special treatment. Subject used profanity and made threats against courthouse personnel. When informed she would be detained pending identification verification, subject attempted to flee and had to be physically restrained. The lies flowed as easily as water. Hayes had perfected this process through years of covering his tracks. Internal affairs investigations that went nowhere. Civilian complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. a chain of command that valued results over methods. "What about her briefcase?" Rodriguez asked. "Those looked like real legal documents." Hayes paused his writing. The briefcase was a problem. Professional quality documents scattered across the courthouse steps would be harder to explain away. But Hayes had survived worse challenges to his authority. "Probably stolen," he said, continuing to write. "These people grab whatever they can to make themselves look legitimate. I've seen suspects with stolen police uniforms, fake badges, counterfeit identification. A briefcase full of legal papers doesn't prove anything." Rodriguez nodded reluctantly. He had seen enough criminal ingenuity to know that Hayes's explanation was plausible, and questioning a senior officer's judgment was a good way to end up on midnight patrols in the worst neighborhoods. Hayes finished his incident report and reviewed it with satisfaction. Every detail supported his version of events. Every fabrication was plausible enough to survive casual scrutiny. Every lie was constructed to transform victim into perpetrator. "Now we need witness statements," Hayes said, pulling out additional forms. "Carlos, you witnessed the subject's aggressive behavior, right?" Rodriguez felt the weight of institutional pressure settling on his shoulders. He could tell the truth and risk his career, or he could support a colleague and maintain his standing in the department. The choice felt inevitable. "Right," Rodriguez said quietly. "Aggressive behavior." Hayes smiled and handed him a witness statement form. "Just write what you saw." Subject acting suspicious, becoming combative when questioned, requiring physical restraint for officer safety. Rodriguez took the form with trembling hands. Each word he would write would bind him deeper into Hayes's web of lies. But backing out now would mean admitting he had been complicit from the beginning. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson had returned to her patrol duties, but the morning's events gnawed at her conscience. She had seen Hayes cross lines before, but something about this arrest felt different. The woman's dignity even in handcuffs. The quality of the scattered legal documents. The way she had known Hayes's name. Thompson pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the Atlanta Police Department's internal directory. If the woman really worked at the courthouse, there might be some record of her employment. Some way to verify her claims before Hayes's narrative became official record. But courthouse staff directories were protected information, and Thompson lacked the clearance to access federal employee databases. She would have to trust that Hayes was following proper procedures, that his 23 years of experience guided his actions. She put the phone away and focused on her patrol route, pushing her doubts into the mental compartment where good officers stored uncomfortable questions. Back in Cell 3, Rachel had begun cataloging every detail that would later become evidence. The time of her arrest, 8:47 a.m. according to the corridor clock visible through her cell door. Hayes's badge number, 4419, which she had memorized during the assault. The presence of multiple witnesses who could corroborate or contradict his version of events. She also began preparing for the legal battle ahead. Hayes would charge her with disorderly conduct, possibly resisting arrest, maybe even assaulting a police officer if he was feeling creative. She would need to respond carefully, revealing just enough legal knowledge to mount an effective defense without telegraphing her true identity. The handcuffs had cut off circulation to her fingers, leaving them numb and swollen. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to deep purple, and she could feel her left eye beginning to swell shut. Every injury would become evidence of Hayes's excessive force. Rachel had prosecuted enough police brutality cases to know the system's weaknesses. Officers who thought they were untouchable. Supervisors who valued loyalty over truth. A culture that closed ranks against any outside criticism. But she also knew the system's strengths. Federal courts that took constitutional violations seriously. Civil rights laws with real teeth. And most importantly, security cameras that recorded everything, even when officers forgot they were being watched. Hayes checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. Judge Harrison would be convening his temporary session soon, and Hayes wanted to get this case processed quickly. The longer the woman sat in custody, the more questions people might ask. Better to get her before a judge, accept a guilty plea, and move on to the next arrest. He walked back towards Cell 3, his key ring jangling with authority. Through the small window, he could see the woman sitting calmly on the concrete bench, her posture straight despite the handcuffs, her eyes focused on some point beyond the cell walls. "Time for your hearing," Hayes announced, unlocking the door. "Hope you're ready to face justice." Rachel looked up at him with steady eyes. "Officer Hayes, I believe justice is exactly what we're all going to face today." Something in her tone made Hayes pause. There was no fear in her voice, no desperation of someone facing criminal charges. Instead, she sounded almost confident. He shook off the feeling and grabbed her arm roughly. "Move it. Judge Harrison doesn't like to be kept waiting." As they walked toward the elevator that would take them to the temporary courtroom, Rachel caught sight of her reflection in the polished marble walls. Bruised, handcuffed, dressed in torn civilian clothes, she looked nothing like the federal judge who commanded respect in courtrooms across the district. But appearances could be deceiving, and Hayes was about to learn that the hardest lesson of his life was waiting just 3 floors above. Ever notice how the people who talk the loudest about law and order are often the first to break the law? The elevator climbed toward courtroom 205, where Judge Harrison held his temporary sessions. Rachel's mind worked with surgical precision, cataloging every procedural violation Hayes had committed. Failure to properly identify a suspect. Use of excessive force without justification. Denial of constitutional rights. Each violation would become a federal case when the truth emerged. But Hayes felt invincible. 23 years of getting away with similar conduct had convinced him that the system would always protect him. He had perfected the art of transforming victims into criminals, and today would be no different. "You know what's going to happen in there?" Hayes said as the elevator doors opened. "Judge Harrison is going to ask how you plead. You're going to say guilty. You're going to accept whatever sentence he gives you. And then you're going to disappear back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Rachel remained silent, but her lawyer's mind was already preparing her defense. She would have to be careful, revealing enough legal knowledge to protect herself without exposing her true identity too early. Hayes's violence suggested he was capable of much worse if he felt cornered. The corridor outside courtroom 205 buzzed with morning activity. Public defenders huddled with clients. Court clerks wheeled files between offices. Federal marshals processed defendants for various hearings. But Rachel noticed something troubling. None of the marshals were the ones she knew from her own courtroom. These were temporary assignments, officers unfamiliar with courthouse personnel who might recognize her. Hayes marched Rachel past the bench where other defendants waited for their hearings. A teenager charged with shoplifting. An elderly man accused of disturbing the peace. People who would normally appear before her own bench, seeking justice from a system that had just brutalized the very judge meant to protect them. "Next case," Hayes called out as they entered the courtroom. Judge Harrison looked up from his paperwork. Gerald Harrison was 62 years old, a retired state court judge brought back for temporary federal assignments. His knowledge of federal law was limited, his patience for constitutional nuance even more so. He preferred quick resolutions that cleared his docket efficiently. "Officer Hayes," Harrison nodded approvingly. "What do we have this morning?" Hayes straightened his uniform and adopted his most professional demeanor. The same voice that had hurled racial slurs 20 minutes earlier now carried the measured tone of law enforcement authority. "Your Honor, I present case number FD 2023-1047. Defendant was apprehended attempting to breach courthouse security this morning at approximately 8:45 a.m. Rachel took her seat at the defendant's table, her handcuffs making it difficult to position herself properly. The irony was suffocating. She had sat behind this same bench just last week, presiding over a civil rights case involving police misconduct. Now she experienced the system from the perspective of those she had sworn to protect. "State your name for the record," Harrison commanded. Rachel paused. Revealing her identity now would expose Hayes's lies immediately, but it might also escalate his desperation to dangerous levels. She decided to test the waters carefully. "Rachel Montgomery, Your Honor." Hayes scribbled notes on his incident report, adding the name to his fabricated narrative. The name meant nothing to him. Just another criminal to process through the system he controlled. "Ms. Montgomery," Harrison continued, "you are charged with disorderly conduct, trespassing on federal property, and resisting arrest. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. Harrison's eyebrows raised slightly. Most defendants in his temporary court pled guilty to avoid the hassle of trial. A not guilty plea meant paperwork, scheduling, and additional hearings that complicated his efficient docket management. Very well, Harrison sighed. Officer Hayes, please present your testimony regarding this morning's incident. Hayes approached the witness stand with practiced confidence. He had delivered similar testimony hundreds of times, his lies polished smooth by repetition. Rodriguez and Thompson took seats in the gallery, their presence lending credibility to whatever story Hayes chose to tell. Your Honor, Hayes began, raising his right hand for the oath. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The words tasted like ash in Rachel's mouth. She watched a sworn police officer prepare to commit perjury in her own courthouse, protected by a system that valued authority over accuracy. At approximately 8:45 a.m. this morning, Hayes testified, I was conducting routine security patrol outside the federal courthouse when I observed the defendant acting suspiciously. She was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings and appeared to be surveilling the building for potential security vulnerabilities. Rachel's fingers clenched involuntarily. Every word was a calculated lie, designed to transform her morning routine into criminal conduct. But she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that emotional reactions would only support Hayes's fabricated narrative. When I approached to conduct a standard security inquiry, Hayes continued, the defendant became immediately hostile and verbally aggressive. She refused to provide identification and claimed to have special privileges that would exempt her from normal security procedures. Judge Harrison nodded along, his expression suggesting complete acceptance of Hayes's testimony. This was the kind of straightforward law enforcement narrative he preferred. Clear facts, obvious criminal behavior, simple resolution. Did the defendant make any specific threats? Harrison asked. Hayes paused, crafting his next lie carefully. Yes, Your Honor. She stated that she would have my badge and that I would regret treating her this way. She claimed connections to federal officials who would protect her from arrest. Rachel's jaw tightened. Hayes was twisting her professional confidence into criminal threats, her knowledge of courthouse personnel into suspicious claims of influence. But worse, she realized he actually believed his own lies. 23 years of unchecked authority had convinced him that his version of events was reality. What happened next? Harrison prompted. The defendant attempted to push past me toward the courthouse entrance, Hayes said, his voice growing more dramatic. When I moved to detain her for questioning, she became physically combative. She swung her briefcase at my head and tried to kick me in the groin. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in the gallery. He had witnessed the entire incident, and nothing Hayes described had actually occurred. But challenging a senior officer's testimony would end his career, while supporting it would simply continue the status quo. I was forced to use minimal necessary force to protect myself and maintain courthouse security, Hayes concluded. The defendant continued to resist even after being properly restrained, requiring additional officers to assist with her transport. Harrison turned to Rachel with obvious skepticism. In his experience, defendants who claimed innocence usually had elaborate explanations that crumbled under examination. He expected this woman to spin some fantastic story about police brutality or constitutional violations. Ms. Montgomery, Harrison said, you may present your version of events. Rachel stood carefully, her handcuffs making normal gestures impossible. She had to navigate this moment with extraordinary precision, revealing enough truth to undermine Hayes's lies without exposing herself to additional violence. Your Honor, I respectfully request that you review the courthouse security footage before accepting Officer Hayes's testimony. The simple statement landed like a bomb in the quiet courtroom. Hayes's face went white. Rodriguez suddenly found his shoes extremely interesting. Even Harrison paused, sensing that this case might be more complicated than he had assumed. Security footage? Harrison asked. Yes, Your Honor. The federal courthouse maintains comprehensive video surveillance of all entrances and public areas. The footage will show exactly what occurred this morning at 8:47 a.m. on the front steps. Hayes jumped to his feet. Your Honor, the defendant is obviously trying to delay proceedings with frivolous motions. Security footage reviews require federal authorization and could take weeks to process. But Rachel was just getting started. Her legal expertise was beginning to surface, and Hayes was powerless to stop it. Your Honor, I'm familiar with federal courthouse security protocols. The footage is available immediately through the central monitoring station. It requires no special authorization to review video from this morning's incident. Harrison looked confused. How would a defendant know specific details about federal security procedures? And why was she speaking with the confident tone of someone familiar with courthouse operations? Furthermore, Rachel continued, Officer Hayes' testimony contains several factual impossibilities that the video evidence will clearly contradict. He claims I swung my briefcase at his head, but the briefcase was scattered across the courthouse steps before any physical contact occurred. He claims I attempted to kick him, but the video will show I was against the wall with my arms restrained throughout the encounter. Hayes felt his carefully constructed narrative beginning to crumble. This woman wasn't supposed to know courthouse procedures. She wasn't supposed to understand evidence protocols. She was supposed to be another easy conviction that padded his arrest statistics. Your Honor, Hayes said desperately, the defendant is clearly more sophisticated than initially appeared. This suggests possible gang or organized crime connections that make her even more dangerous than my original assessment indicated. Rachel almost smiled. Hayes was digging his hole deeper with every word, creating more lies to cover his original fabrications. But each additional lie would make his eventual downfall more spectacular. Officer Hayes, Rachel said calmly, are you suggesting that knowledge of basic constitutional rights indicates criminal organization? Are you testifying that citizens who understand legal procedures are inherently suspicious? The questions exposed the absurdity of Hayes' position. Harrison began to sense that something was wrong with this case, though he couldn't yet identify what. The defendant spoke like a lawyer, understood courthouse procedures like court personnel, and showed no fear of a legal system that should have intimidated her. Your Honor, Rachel continued, I also request that you examine the police report Officer Hayes filed regarding this incident. Federal law requires that arrest reports be filed within 1 hour of detention. The report should indicate the exact time of my alleged crimes, the specific laws I supposedly violated, and the evidence supporting each charge. Hayes realized with growing horror that his hastily written report was full of holes. Timestamps that didn't match. Charges that weren't supported by evidence. Witness statements that contradicted each other. His 23 years of getting away with sloppy police work had made him careless. Additionally, Rachel said, her voice gaining strength, I request that Officer Rodriguez and Officer Thompson, who were present during the incident, provide their testimony under oath. Federal law requires that all witnesses to police use of force incidents provide sworn statements. Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead. He had signed Hayes' fabricated witness statement without reading it carefully. Now he would have to testify under oath, knowing that perjury in federal court carried a 5-year prison sentence. Thompson remained silent in the gallery, but her mind was racing. She had seen enough of the incident to know that Hayes' testimony was pure fiction. But contradicting a senior officer would destroy her career, while supporting his lies would make her complicit in federal crimes. Harrison looked around his courtroom with growing unease. What had seemed like a simple disorderly conduct case was becoming a complex federal investigation. The defendant demonstrated legal knowledge that seemed impossible for a common criminal. The arresting officer's story contained contradictions that were becoming harder to ignore. Ms. Montgomery, Harrison said carefully, exactly what is your background that makes you so familiar with federal court procedures? Rachel paused. This was the moment of truth. She could continue hiding her identity and hope to survive Hayes' fabricated charges, or she could begin revealing the truth and risk whatever desperate measures Hayes might take. She looked directly at Hayes, her eyes holding steady despite the bruises on her face. Your Honor, I believe that question will be answered very clearly when you review the security footage and examine the legal documents that Officer Hayes scattered across the courthouse steps during his unprovoked assault. Hayes felt something cold settle in his stomach. For the first time in 23 years, he sensed that his authority might not be enough to control the situation. This woman knew too much, understood too much, feared too little. But he was committed now. His lies were on official record. His reputation was at stake. His career depended on making his version of events stick, no matter what evidence emerged to contradict it. "Your Honor," Hayes said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "I request that the defendant be held without bail pending further investigation." Her sophisticated knowledge of federal procedures suggests she may be part of a larger criminal organization targeting courthouse security. The accusation was desperate, but it bought Hayes time to figure out how to salvage his fabricated case. He needed to discover who this woman really was before she could destroy everything he had built. Rachel sat back down, her handcuffs clicking against the defendant's table. Hayes thought he was buying time, but he was actually providing her with the perfect opportunity to prepare his destruction. Have you ever wondered how many innocent people sit in jail because someone in uniform decided to lie? Judge Harrison stared at the paperwork before him, his usual confidence shaken by the morning's unexpected complexities. What should have been a routine, disorderly conduct hearing had evolved into something that made his administrative instincts scream warnings. The defendant's legal sophistication, the arresting officer's increasingly elaborate explanations, and the growing number of procedural requests created a perfect storm of judicial headaches. "Given the unusual circumstances of this case," Harrison announced, "I'm ordering a 2-hour recess to allow proper review of the requested evidence. Ms. Montgomery will remain in federal custody pending examination of the security footage and supporting documentation." Hayes felt a mixture of relief and terror. 2 hours gave him time to control the narrative, but it also gave his victim time to prepare her defense. He needed to find out exactly who Rachel Montgomery was before she could expose his lies to federal scrutiny. "Your Honor," Hayes interjected, "I respectfully request permission to conduct additional investigation during the recess." The defendant's sophisticated knowledge of federal procedures suggests possible connections to ongoing criminal investigations. Harrison nodded absently, already planning how to minimize his involvement in what was clearly becoming a complicated federal matter. "Permission granted. Court will reconvene at 12:30 p.m. As the courtroom cleared, Hayes grabbed Rodriguez by the arm with barely contained desperation. "Carlos, I need you to run a full background check on Rachel Montgomery. Check every database we have access to. Criminal history, employment records, known associates, everything." Rodriguez nodded reluctantly, understanding that he was now fully committed to Hayes's fabricated narrative. "What if she comes back clean?" "She won't," Hayes said with false confidence. "Nobody knows federal procedures that well without being involved in the system somehow. We just need to find her angle." Meanwhile, Thompson had remained in the gallery, her conscience eating at her like acid. She pulled out her phone and began searching for information about courthouse personnel, hoping to find some explanation for the morning's events that didn't require her to choose between truth and career survival. Rachel was escorted back to cell 3, but this time the space felt different. No longer a place of victimization, it had become her war room. She used the 2-hour recess to mentally prepare the legal strategy that would destroy Hayes's fabricated case and expose the systemic corruption that enabled his behavior. First, she cataloged every procedural violation Hayes had committed. Assault without justification violated her Fourth Amendment rights. Denial of proper identification procedures violated federal courthouse security protocols. Filing false reports violated multiple federal statutes. Each violation carried serious criminal penalties that could end Hayes's career and land him in federal prison. Second, she analyzed the weaknesses in Hayes's fabricated testimony. His timeline didn't match courthouse security protocols. His description of her alleged aggressive behavior contradicted the physical evidence of his assault. His claims about her resistance were impossible given the handcuff placement and wall positioning during the attack. Third, she prepared her revelation strategy. Simply announcing her judicial identity would shock the courtroom, but it needed to be done in a way that maximized legal impact while minimizing Hayes's opportunity to escalate violence or destroy evidence. But Rachel also understood the broader implications of what was happening. Hayes wasn't an isolated bad actor. He was a product of systemic problems that allowed racist violence to flourish under the protection of law enforcement authority. Her case would become a federal investigation that could expose years of similar conduct. Down the corridor, Hayes was discovering that Rachel Montgomery existed in federal databases, but not in the ways he expected. Rodriguez returned from his computer searches with information that made Hayes's situation exponentially worse. "Derek, you need to see this," Rodriguez said, his face pale with concern. "Rachel Montgomery isn't just some random defendant. She's listed in the Federal Employee Directory." Hayes grabbed the printout with trembling hands. "Federal employee? What department?" "That's the problem. The listing shows her as a judicial branch employee, but the specific position is classified above our access level. We can see that she works for the Northern District of Georgia Federal Court System, but we can't see her actual job title." Hayes felt his world beginning to collapse. A federal courthouse employee would have legitimate access to the building. She would know security procedures, understand legal protocols, and have connections throughout the judicial system. Every aspect of his fabricated narrative was crumbling under the weight of this single piece of information. "Maybe she's a clerk," Hayes said desperately. "Or a secretary. That would explain the legal knowledge without making this a major federal incident." But Rodriguez was already shaking his head. "Derek, the access level classification suggests something much higher than clerical staff. And look at this." He handed Hayes another printout showing Rachel's courthouse parking assignment. Reserved Space 3, which was located in the judicial parking area restricted to judges and senior court officials. Hayes stared at the papers in disbelief. Reserved parking spaces in federal courthouses weren't assigned to secretaries or clerks. They were reserved for people with serious federal authority. People who could destroy careers with a phone call. People who definitely didn't belong in handcuffs facing fabricated criminal charges. "We need to fix this," Hayes said, his voice cracking with panic. "We need to make this go away before it gets worse." But Rodriguez was already calculating his own survival strategy. "Derek, if she's high-level federal personnel, this isn't going away. This is going to become a federal investigation. FBI, Internal Affairs, maybe even Department of Justice involvement." The two officers stood in the corridor outside the holding cells, both realizing that the morning's events had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Hayes's 23-year career was hanging by a thread, and Rodriguez's complicity in the fabricated witness statements made him an accessory to federal crimes. Meanwhile, Thompson had made her own discoveries through courthouse gossip networks. She approached a federal marshal she knew from previous interactions, hoping to get information without revealing her involvement in the morning's incident. "Hey Marcus," she said casually, "do you know if there are any VIPs in the building today? My sergeant mentioned something about extra security protocols." Deputy Marshal Marcus Williams looked up from his paperwork. "VIPs? Not that I know of. Judge Montgomery is supposed to be in her chambers preparing for this afternoon's hearings, but she's not exactly a VIP. Just our regular federal judge." Thompson felt her blood turn to ice water. "Judge Montgomery?" "Yeah, Rachel Montgomery. She's been our federal judge for about 3 years now. Young, brilliant, doesn't take any crap from lawyers who try to waste her time." "Why?" Thompson's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. The legal sophistication. The knowledge of courthouse procedures. The confidence even in handcuffs. The reason she knew Hayes's name from previous courthouse interactions. Rachel Montgomery wasn't just a federal employee. She was a federal judge. And Hayes had assaulted, handcuffed, and charged her with criminal conduct in her own courthouse. "Oh God," Thompson whispered, the full magnitude of the situation crashing over her like a tsunami. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, concerned by Thompson's sudden pallor. "Nothing," Thompson lied, her mind racing to calculate damage control options. "I just remembered something I need to handle." She walked away on unsteady legs, knowing that her career in law enforcement was probably over. She had witnessed a federal judge being brutally assaulted and had done nothing to stop it. Worse, she had allowed Hayes to fabricate criminal charges without speaking up. Her silence made her complicit in federal crimes that carried prison sentences. Back in Cell 3, Rachel was using her legal training to prepare for the afternoon's revelations. She understood that her identity disclosure would destroy Hayes professionally and criminally, but she also knew that systemic change required more than individual punishment. Her case needed to become a catalyst for broader reforms that prevented similar incidents. She was also calculating the personal costs of her situation. The physical assault would heal, but the psychological impact of being victimized by the system she served would take longer to process. The bruises on her face would fade, but the knowledge that her judicial authority couldn't protect her from racist violence would reshape how she viewed her role and her safety. Most importantly, Rachel was preparing to transform from victim back to judge. In 90 minutes, she would resume her position of authority and begin the process of holding Hayes accountable for his crimes. But she would do so with a deeper understanding of how the system felt from the perspective of those it was meant to protect. Hayes spent the remaining recess time desperately trying to construct a narrative that could survive Rachel's federal employee status. Maybe she was a disgruntled courthouse worker with a grudge against police. Maybe she had been fired and was attempting illegal access to the building. Maybe her federal employment was irrelevant to her alleged criminal behavior. But every explanation required additional lies, and Hayes was running out of credible fabrications. Worse, his previous testimony was now on official record, creating a permanent trail of perjury that federal prosecutors could follow straight to criminal convictions. Rodriguez tried to distance himself from the situation by claiming he had only followed Hayes's lead, but his signed witness statement contradicting the physical evidence made him equally vulnerable to federal charges. He began drafting his resignation letter, hoping to minimize legal exposure by leaving law enforcement before the investigation intensified. Thompson wrestled with her conscience, knowing that speaking up now might save her career while remaining silent would make her complicit in escalating federal crimes. She had 30 minutes to decide whether to come forward with the truth or continue enabling Hayes's fabricated narrative. As 12:30 p.m. approached, the courthouse buzzed with unusual energy. Word was spreading through unofficial channels that something significant was happening in Courtroom 205. Federal marshals were paying closer attention to the proceedings. Court clerks were whispering about irregularities in the morning schedule. Security personnel were reviewing footage that should have been routine. Rachel sat in her cell, listening to the courthouse's familiar sounds. She could hear the elevator carrying people to hearings on higher floors. She could hear the distant hum of legal proceedings that continued despite the morning's chaos. She could hear the sound of justice functioning, even when individual participants tried to corrupt it. But most clearly, she could hear the approaching footsteps of officers coming to escort her back to the courtroom where truth would finally speak louder than lies. Hayes straightened his uniform one final time, checking his appearance in the courthouse bathroom mirror. His reflection showed a man trying to project authority while internal panic consumed him. He had built his career on the assumption that his badge made him untouchable, but that assumption was about to be tested by someone with greater authority than he had ever imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation between corrupt power and legitimate authority, between racist assumptions and judicial reality, between a system that protected bad actors and a system designed to deliver justice. In 30 minutes, Rachel Montgomery would stop being a victim and resume being a federal judge. And Hayes would discover that some people really could have his badge, destroy his career, and make him regret his choices in ways he had never imagined possible. Ever notice how bullies always crumble when they finally face real consequences? At exactly 12:30 p.m., the courthouse clock tower chimed as Rachel was escorted back into Courtroom 205. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically during the recess. Federal marshals now flanked the entrance, their presence indicating that someone in authority had begun asking serious questions about the morning's proceedings. Judge Harrison looked visibly uncomfortable as he called the session to order. During the break, he had received 2 phone calls that transformed his understanding of the situation. The first came from Chief Judge Patricia Holbrook, asking why her colleague Rachel Montgomery hadn't appeared for their scheduled 11 a.m. meeting. The second came from Court Administrator Thomas Jen, wondering why Judge Montgomery's morning docket had been mysteriously cleared without explanation. "Before we proceed," Harrison announced, his voice betraying his nervousness, "I want to ensure all parties understand that this court takes allegations of misconduct very seriously, whether committed by defendants or law enforcement officers." Hayes felt his stomach drop. The judge's warning suggested that someone had provided information during the recess that cast doubt on his testimony. He scanned the courtroom, noting the federal marshals who hadn't been present earlier, the court reporter who was now recording everything with unusual intensity, and most troubling, the presence of Deputy Chief Laura Davidson from Internal Affairs. Rachel took her seat at the defendant's table, but her demeanor had evolved during the recess. The shock and vulnerability from the morning assault had been replaced by the focused intensity of a federal judge preparing to dismantle perjured testimony. Her handcuffs remained, but she wore them now like evidence rather than restraints. "Your Honor," Rachel began, her voice carrying new authority. "During the recess, I hope you had the opportunity to review the courthouse security footage as requested." Harrison nodded reluctantly. He had indeed reviewed the footage, and what he saw made him question every assumption about the case. The video showed Hayes assaulting a woman who posed no threat, fabricating justifications for violence, and demonstrating the exact opposite of professional law enforcement conduct. "The court has reviewed relevant security materials," Harrison said carefully, avoiding specifics that might complicate his position further. "Excellent," Rachel continued. "Then you observed that Officer Hayes's sworn testimony contains multiple factual impossibilities that are contradicted by video evidence." Hayes jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I object to the defendant's characterization of my testimony. She lacks legal standing to make accusations against sworn law enforcement officers." Rachel smiled for the first time since her arrest. Officer Hayes raises an interesting point about legal standing. Perhaps this would be an appropriate time to clarify exactly who has standing to challenge perjured testimony in federal court. She turned to face Hayes directly, her eyes holding steady despite the bruises on her face. "Officer Hayes, you testified under oath that I was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings. Can you explain to the court what constitutes appropriate courtroom attire for someone in my position?" Hayes sensed a trap but couldn't identify its nature. Defendants should dress respectfully when appearing before federal judges. Business attire, conservative colors, nothing that shows disrespect for the court's authority. "I see," Rachel said. "And in your 23 years of law enforcement experience, how many federal judges have you seen arrive at work in casual civilian clothing?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Hayes realized with growing horror that she was leading him toward a revelation he couldn't escape. But answering honestly would undermine his testimony, while lying further would compound his perjury. Federal judges typically wear robes during court proceedings," Hayes stammered. "Indeed they do," Rachel agreed. "But what about when they arrive at work in the morning? When they're carrying case files to their chambers? When they're simply going about their daily routines before putting on those robes?" Harrison felt sweat beading on his forehead as he began to understand the direction of Rachel's questioning. The phone calls during recess were starting to make terrible sense. "Officer Hayes," Rachel continued, "you also testified that I claimed connections to federal officials who would protect me from arrest. Can you repeat for the court exactly what I said about my relationship to federal officials?" Hayes's mind raced, trying to remember his fabricated testimony while sensing that any answer would destroy him. You claimed that you would have my badge. That I would regret treating you this way. And did you consider the possibility that someone might actually have the authority to take your badge?" Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in the gallery, finally understanding why the defendant's confidence had never wavered. Thompson sat frozen, knowing that her failure to speak up during the morning assault was about to become the defining mistake of her career. "Your Honor," Rachel said, turning back to Harrison, "I believe this would be an appropriate time to examine the legal documents that Officer Hayes scattered across the courthouse steps during his unprovoked assault." She gestured toward a manila folder that had been placed on the prosecution table during the recess. "Those documents should clarify any questions about my authority to challenge perjured testimony or my relationship to federal officials." Harrison's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside were judicial orders bearing Rachel's signature, case files from her current docket, and most damning of all, a judicial identification card that clearly established her federal authority. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Harrison processed the magnitude of the situation. Hayes had assaulted a federal judge, filed false criminal charges against a sitting member of the federal judiciary, committed perjury while testifying about his victim's alleged crimes. "Ms. Montgomery," Harrison said quietly, "would you please state your full title for the court record?" Rachel stood slowly, her handcuffs preventing normal courtroom protocol but unable to diminish her inherent authority. "The Honorable Rachel Montgomery, United States District Judge for the Northern District of Georgia, appointed by the President and confirmed by the United States Senate." The words exploded through the courtroom like grenades. Hayes staggered backward, his face draining of all color as the full scope of his destruction became clear. He hadn't just assaulted a random black woman. He had brutalized a federal judge who possessed the authority to destroy his life with legal precision. Rodriguez buried his face in his hands, knowing that his signed witness statement supporting Hayes's fabricated narrative made him complicit in federal crimes carrying decades in prison. Thompson felt her world collapsing as she realized her silence during a federal judge's assault would end her career and possibly her freedom. Furthermore, Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, I should clarify for Officer Hayes that his assumptions about my qualifications were somewhat inaccurate. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, served as a federal prosecutor for 8 years specializing in civil rights violations, and spent 3 years in private practice before my federal appointment. I have prosecuted dozens of cases involving police misconduct and am intimately familiar with the federal statutes governing law enforcement conduct. Hayes felt his knees buckle as he understood that his victim wasn't just a federal judge, but a federal judge who specialized in prosecuting exactly the crimes he had committed. His racist assumptions had led him to assault the one person in Georgia most qualified to destroy him legally. Your Honor, Rachel said, addressing Harrison directly, I believe this situation demonstrates why proper identification procedures exist. If Officer Hayes had followed standard courthouse security protocols instead of making assumptions based on racial bias, this entire incident could have been avoided. Harrison struggled to process the legal implications cascading around him. He was presiding over a case where a police officer had filed false charges against a federal judge who outranked him significantly in the judicial hierarchy. Every decision he made would be scrutinized by federal authorities who could end his temporary appointment. Judge Montgomery, Harrison said carefully, how would you like to proceed? Rachel paused, understanding that her response would determine not just Hayes's fate, but the broader message about accountability in the federal system. She could request immediate dismissal of all charges and file federal civil rights complaints later. Or she could use this moment to expose the systemic problems that enabled Hayes's behavior. Your Honor, I believe justice requires full examination of this morning's events. The security footage should be entered into evidence. Officer Hayes's incident report should be compared against the video record. And all witness statements should be reviewed for accuracy. She turned to face Hayes, who stood paralyzed by the magnitude of his legal exposure. I particularly want to ensure that Officer Rodriguez and Officer Thompson have the opportunity to provide truthful testimony about what they witnessed. Rodriguez felt his career evaporating as he realized Rachel knew about his false witness statement. Thompson understood that her failure to intervene during a federal judge's assault would become a federal investigation that could result in criminal charges. Additionally, Rachel continued, I believe the court should examine whether this incident represents an isolated occurrence or part of a pattern of misconduct that requires broader investigation. Hayes finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Judge Montgomery, I didn't know who you were. If I had known. Rachel's eyes blazed with controlled fury. Officer Hayes, that statement reveals the entire problem. You assaulted me because you didn't think I was important enough to treat with basic human dignity. You assumed my race and casual dress meant I belonged in cages, not courthouses, as you so eloquently put it. The courtroom recorder captured every word as Rachel systematically dismantled the racist assumptions that led to her assault. You didn't fail to recognize my authority, Officer Hayes. You failed to recognize my humanity. Harrison realized he was witnessing a moment that would reshape federal law enforcement accountability. A sitting federal judge had been brutalized by the system she served, and her response would send messages throughout every police department in the country. Your Honor, Rachel said, her voice carrying the full weight of federal judicial authority, I formally request that this case be transferred to federal prosecutors for investigation of civil rights violations, perjury, filing false police reports, and assault under color of law. I also request that the FBI initiate a pattern and practice investigation into the Atlanta Police Department's courthouse security procedures. Hayes collapsed into his chair as the full scope of his destruction became clear. Federal prosecutors would dissect every aspect of his 23-year career. The FBI would investigate every arrest he had made, every report he had filed, every complaint that had been buried by departmental politics. Rodriguez stood up abruptly and walked toward the exit, knowing that his involvement in fabricating witness statements would be discovered within hours. Thompson remained frozen, calculating whether cooperation with federal investigators might save her from criminal prosecution. "Judge Montgomery," Harrison said, "given your judicial status, should this court consider releasing you from custody pending federal investigation?" Rachel looked down at her handcuffs, then back at Hayes, who had placed them there. "Your Honor, I believe these restraints should remain until Officer Hayes explains to the court why he felt authorized to handcuff a federal judge in her own courthouse." The question forced Hayes to confront the racism that had driven his actions. He couldn't claim ignorance of courthouse personnel identification procedures. He couldn't justify his failure to follow basic security protocols. He could only acknowledge that his assumptions about Rachel's worthiness of respect had been based on racial prejudice. "I have no explanation," Hayes whispered, his 23-year career ending with those 4 words. Rachel nodded slowly, understanding that truth had finally emerged from the wreckage of Hayes's fabricated narrative. But she also knew that individual accountability was only the beginning of the systemic changes this incident would require. Sometimes the people who claim to serve justice become the very ones who need to face it. The handcuffs clicked open with a metallic sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. Federal Marshal Williams had arrived with the proper keys, his face grim as he processed the magnitude of what had occurred in his courthouse. As the restraints fell away from Rachel's wrists, she rubbed the deep red marks where the metal had cut into her skin during 3 hours of unnecessary captivity. "Judge Montgomery," Marshal Williams said quietly, "I apologize on behalf of the entire federal law enforcement community. This should never have happened." Rachel nodded, understanding that Williams represented the professional law enforcement officers who took their constitutional oaths seriously. His presence reminded her that Hayes was an aberration, not a representation of all police officers. "Thank you, Marshal Williams," Rachel replied. "I know there are good officers who would never condone this behavior." Hayes sat slumped in his chair, watching his victim's dignity and grace even in the aftermath of his brutal assault. For the first time in 23 years, he was forced to see beyond his racist assumptions and confront the humanity of someone he had dehumanized. Judge Harrison struggled to maintain courtroom decorum while processing the legal earthquake that had just occurred. "Judge Montgomery, given the extraordinary circumstances, how would you like to proceed with these proceedings?" Rachel stood slowly, her emerald sweater torn and stained, her face bearing the purple bruises of Hayes's violence, but her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal judicial power. "Your Honor, I believe this situation provides an opportunity for education as well as accountability. With the court's permission, I would like to explain to Officer Hayes and everyone present exactly what went wrong this morning and how it can be prevented in the future." Harrison nodded, recognizing that he was about to witness something unprecedented. A federal judge using her own assault as a teaching moment about constitutional rights and police accountability. Rachel turned to face Hayes directly, her eyes holding steady despite the physical and emotional trauma she had endured. "Officer Hayes, do you understand that your actions this morning violated multiple federal statutes?" Hayes looked up reluctantly, his career-long arrogance replaced by the dawning realization of his legal jeopardy. "Yes, Judge Montgomery. Can you tell me which constitutional amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures?" The question was basic enough for a first-year police academy student, but Hayes found himself struggling to answer while facing the judge he had brutalized. "The Fourth Amendment. Correct. And did you have probable cause to believe I was committing a crime when you decided to assault me?" Hayes's mind raced through his fabricated justifications, but none of them would survive legal scrutiny. "No, Your Honor. Did you follow proper identification procedures before using physical force?" "No, Your Honor. Did you attempt de-escalation or verbal communication before resorting to violence?" "No, Your Honor." Each admission carved away another piece of Hayes's constructed narrative, leaving only the raw truth of his racist assumptions and violent response. But Rachel wasn't finished with her constitutional education. "Officer Hayes, you also violated my rights under the 14th Amendment. Can you tell me what that amendment guarantees?" Hayes felt sweat dripping down his back as he struggled to remember constitutional basics while facing his victim's judicial authority. "Equal protection under the law." "Exactly. You treated me differently than you would have treated a white woman in identical circumstances. Your assumption that my race made me inherently suspicious violated my right to equal treatment under federal law. The courtroom gallery had filled during the recess as word spread through the courthouse about the extraordinary proceedings. Federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and law enforcement officials watched as a sitting federal judge methodically dismantled police misconduct from both sides of the courtroom. Rodriguez had returned to the courtroom, his resignation letter in hand, knowing that cooperation with the inevitable federal investigation might be his only chance to avoid prison. Thompson sat rigidly in her chair, finally understanding that her silence during a federal judge's assault made her complicit in federal crimes. "Officer Rodriguez," Rachel said, addressing Hayes's partner directly, "you witnessed this morning's assault. You also signed a witness statement supporting Officer Hayes's fabricated version of events. Would you like to explain to the court why you chose to file false statements in a federal proceeding?" Rodriguez stood on trembling legs, his 8-year career dissolving as he faced the consequences of his choices. "Judge Montgomery, I was following the lead of a senior officer. I thought." "You thought what, Officer Rodriguez? That racial bias was an acceptable basis for police conduct? That lying under oath was an appropriate way to protect a colleague who had committed assault?" Rodriguez had no answer that wouldn't further incriminate him. His silence spoke volumes about the institutional culture that had enabled Hayes's behavior for over 2 decades. Rachel turned her attention to Thompson, who had witnessed the assault but failed to intervene. "Officer Thompson, you had the opportunity to prevent this entire incident by speaking up when you saw Officer Hayes violating my constitutional rights. Instead, you chose silence. Can you explain that choice to the court?" Thompson felt the weight of her moral failure settling on her shoulders like lead. "Judge Montgomery, I was afraid of challenging a senior officer. I was afraid for my career. So you prioritized your career advancement over my constitutional rights?" The question hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system that had created conditions where good officers remained silent while bad officers brutalized citizens. "Yes, Your Honor," Thompson whispered, her voice barely audible. Rachel nodded slowly, understanding that Thompson's honesty was the first step toward accountability. "Officer Thompson, your fear was understandable given the institutional pressures you face. But constitutional rights cannot be protected by officers who prioritize career security over citizen safety." She addressed the entire courtroom, her voice carrying beyond the immediate participants to the broader law enforcement community that would learn about this case. What happened here today represents a system failure, not just individual misconduct. Officer Hayes didn't develop his racist assumptions in isolation. He was enabled by colleagues who remained silent, supervisors who ignored complaints, and a culture that valued loyalty over legality. Marshal Williams stepped forward, his own law enforcement experience giving weight to his words. "Judge Montgomery, speaking for federal law enforcement, we want you to know that Officer Hayes's conduct violates everything we've sworn to protect. His actions dishonor every officer who takes the constitutional oath seriously." Rachel appreciated Williams's statement, but she knew that good intentions wouldn't prevent future incidents without systemic reforms. "Marshal Williams, I believe this case demonstrates why federal oversight of local police departments is sometimes necessary. When officers believe they can assault federal judges without consequences, the system has failed catastrophically." Hayes finally looked up from his chair, his face showing the first genuine emotion he had displayed all day. Not anger or defiance, but something approaching recognition of the harm he had caused. "Judge Montgomery," Hayes said quietly, "I know this doesn't matter now, but I need you to know that seeing you, hearing you speak, makes me realize what I've become." Rachel studied Hayes's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated manipulation. 23 years of judicial experience had taught her to distinguish between authentic accountability and strategic self-preservation. "Officer Hayes, what exactly have you realized?" Hayes struggled to articulate thoughts that challenged everything he had believed about race, authority, and his role as a police officer. "I realized that I've been seeing people like you, black people, as less than human for so long that I forgot you were people at all." The admission was brutal in its honesty, acknowledging the dehumanization that enabled racist violence. Rachel felt a complex mixture of emotions, anger at the harm Hayes had caused, recognition of his belated honesty, and concern for all the other victims who had suffered from his bias. Officer Hayes, how many other people have you treated as less than human during your 23-year career? The question forced Hayes to confront the full scope of his misconduct. How many traffic stops based on racial profiling? How many arrests without probable cause? How many complaints that were dismissed without investigation? I don't know, Hayes said, his voice breaking. Too many. Rachel nodded, understanding that Hayes's recognition of his behavior was necessary but insufficient. Accountability required consequences, not just acknowledgement. Officer Hayes, your realization is important, but it doesn't undo the harm you've caused to me and countless others. It doesn't restore the dignity you stole from people who had no federal judicial authority to fight back. And it doesn't address the systemic problems that enabled your behavior. She turned to address Judge Harrison directly. Your Honor, I formally request that this case be referred to federal prosecutors for comprehensive investigation. I also request that the Department of Justice initiate a pattern and practice review of the Atlanta Police Department's training, supervision, and accountability mechanisms. Harrison nodded, understanding that his role in this historic case was to ensure proper federal jurisdiction took control of the investigation. Judge Montgomery, your requests will be forwarded immediately to appropriate federal authorities. Rachel looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of people who had witnessed constitutional principles under assault and legal justice fighting back. Law students who would study this case in civil rights courses. Police officers who would receive new training about federal authority and racial bias. Citizens who would understand that even federal judges weren't immune to systemic racism. Before we conclude, Rachel said, I want to address something important. What happened to me this morning happens to ordinary citizens every day across this country. The only difference is that my federal judicial authority gave me the power to fight back in ways that most victims cannot. She gestured toward the gallery where community activists and civil rights attorneys had gathered to witness the proceedings. Every person brutalized by police officers who think their authority makes them untouchable deserves the same justice I'm receiving today. Every victim of racial bias deserves federal protection, regardless of their job title or social status. The message was clear. This case wasn't just about punishing individual officers, but about reforming systems that enabled widespread constitutional violations. Hayes listened to Rachel's words with growing understanding of the broader implications of his actions. His assault hadn't just violated one person's rights, it had damaged public trust in law enforcement and demonstrated how racist bias corrupted the entire justice system. Judge Montgomery, Hayes said, standing slowly, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any way I can help make this right? Rachel considered the question carefully. Hayes's cooperation with federal investigators could expose other instances of misconduct and help identify systemic problems. But accountability couldn't be traded for cooperation. Officer Hayes, you can help by telling the complete truth about your conduct over the past 23 years. Every incident, every complaint, every time you let racial bias influence your decisions. Federal investigators will need that information to ensure other victims receive justice. Hayes nodded, understanding that full disclosure was his only path toward any form of redemption. The courthouse clock struck 2:15 p.m. as Rachel prepared to leave courtroom 205, but the day's reckoning was far from over. Federal prosecutors had arrived during the extended hearing, their presence signaling that Hayes's assault on a federal judge would trigger the full weight of federal law enforcement investigation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos approached the bench with a gravity that made everyone in the courtroom understand the magnitude of what was unfolding. Your Honor, the United States Attorney's Office is assuming jurisdiction over this matter immediately. We're treating this as a federal civil rights violation with potential domestic terrorism implications. The words, domestic terrorism, sent shockwaves through the gallery. Hayes's face went ashen as he realized his career wasn't just ending. He was facing decades in federal prison under statutes designed to prosecute the most serious crimes against constitutional democracy. Furthermore, Santos continued, we're initiating a comprehensive investigation into the Atlanta Police Department's policies, training, and supervision that enabled this incident. Officer Hayes's actions suggest systemic failures that require federal intervention. Rachel felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Justice was moving forward, but she knew that Hayes's desperation might make him dangerous. 23 years of unchecked authority don't disappear quietly when faced with federal prosecution. Judge Harrison stood to address the courtroom. Given federal jurisdiction, this court is transferring all materials to U.S. Attorney Santos. Officer Hayes, you are hereby released from witness duty pending federal investigation. But Hayes wasn't ready to surrender his narrative control. As federal marshals moved to escort him from the courtroom, he turned toward Rachel with something approaching panic in his eyes. "You think this makes you the hero?" Hayes said, his voice rising with desperate anger. "You think destroying my career fixes anything?" The outburst violated every principle of courtroom decorum, but Rachel recognized it as the last gasp of someone whose worldview was collapsing. She remained calm, understanding that Hayes's emotional breakdown would only further demonstrate his unfitness for law enforcement. "Officer Hayes," Rachel replied evenly, "this isn't about heroism. It's about accountability under law." "Accountability?" Hayes laughed bitterly. "You want to know about accountability? Let me tell you what this federal investigation is really going to find." Federal prosecutors exchanged glances, recognizing that Hayes was about to make statements that could either help or destroy his case. Santos stepped forward with a warning. "Officer Hayes, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court. You have the right to an attorney." But Hayes was beyond strategic thinking. His racist worldview was crumbling, and he needed to lash out at something, someone, anything that could bear responsibility for his self-destruction. "You think I'm the problem?" Hayes continued, ignoring Santos's warnings. "I've been doing exactly what the Atlanta Police Department trained me to do for 23 years. I've been following orders, implementing policies, and enforcing laws exactly the way my supervisors wanted." Rachel listened with professional detachment, understanding that Hayes was revealing information that would be crucial to the federal pattern and practice investigation. His angry admissions were providing prosecutors with evidence of systemic misconduct. "Every supervisor who approved my conduct reports knew exactly how I operated," Hayes said, his voice gaining momentum. "Every captain who gave me commendations understood what aggressive community policing meant. Every chief who promoted me knew I was keeping certain neighborhoods in line." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in the gallery, realizing that Hayes was implicating the entire command structure in systematic civil rights violations. Thompson felt sick as she understood that her silence hadn't just enabled one bad officer, but it helped cover up departmental policies that violated constitutional law. "Officer Hayes," Santos interrupted, "I strongly advise you to speak with an attorney before making additional statements." But Hayes was determined to drag down everyone who had enabled his conduct. If his career was over, he would ensure that others faced the same consequences. "You want to know about pattern and practice?" Hayes said, turning toward the federal prosecutors. "I can give you 23 years of documentation. Every arrest report that was approved despite obvious constitutional violations. Every complaint that was buried by internal affairs. Every training session that taught us to see black citizens as inherent threats." Rachel watched Hayes's meltdown with judicial detachment, but she felt a chill as she realized the full scope of what he was revealing. His assault on her wasn't an isolated incident of individual racism. It was the product of systemic policies that had militarized police departments against black communities. "Officer Hayes," she said quietly, "are you stating that your assault on me this morning was consistent with Atlanta Police Department training and policy?" Hayes paused, finally recognizing the legal trap he had walked into. Admitting that his conduct was policy-based would expose the entire department to federal liability, but denying it would make him solely responsible for decades of misconduct. "I'm saying," Hayes replied carefully, "that everything I did today was exactly what 23 years of police training taught me to do when dealing with suspicious black individuals." The admission was devastating. Hayes had just testified that his brutal assault on a federal judge was the predictable result of systematic racist training. Federal prosecutors would use his statement to justify comprehensive reform of the entire Atlanta Police Department. Santos stepped forward with additional Miranda warnings. "Officer Hayes, you are now a target of federal investigation. Any further statements you make will be used as evidence in criminal proceedings against you and potentially others." But Hayes seemed unable to stop himself from destroying everything around him. His racist worldview was collapsing, and he needed someone to blame for the consequences of his choices. "You know what the real problem is?" Hayes said, pointing at Rachel. "People like her think they can change everything just by getting fancy law degrees and federal appointments. But the streets don't care about your Harvard education or your judicial robes." The comment revealed the depth of Hayes's resentment toward black achievement. Even facing federal prosecution, he couldn't acknowledge Rachel's qualifications without diminishing them through racial lens. "Officer Hayes," Rachel said, her voice carrying judicial authority despite her torn clothing and bruised face, "my Harvard education and federal appointment are irrelevant to your constitutional obligations. Every citizen, regardless of education or occupation, deserves protection from police violence." Protection. Hayes laughed harshly. "You live in a fantasy world where constitutional rights matter more than public safety. I've spent 23 years protecting citizens from criminals, and now you want to criminalize me for doing my job." The statement demonstrated Hayes's fundamental misunderstanding of police authority. He viewed constitutional rights as obstacles to effective law enforcement rather than as the foundation of legitimate police power. Federal Marshal Williams stepped forward, his patience with Hayes's outburst exhausted. "Officer Hayes, you're disrupting federal court proceedings. You need to remain silent or be removed from the courtroom." But Hayes wasn't finished revealing the extent of systemic problems within his department. His anger had override his self-preservation instincts, and he continued providing evidence that would devastate his colleagues. "You want to investigate patterns?" Hayes said, addressing Santos directly. "Start with Captain Morrison, who taught us that proactive policing meant assuming guilt based on racial profiling. Check Lieutenant Foster's arrest quotas that rewarded officers for targeting black neighborhoods. Review Sergeant Taylor's training sessions about urban threat assessment." Each name Hayes provided would become a target of federal investigation. His desperate attempt to share responsibility was actually providing prosecutors with a roadmap for comprehensive reform litigation. Rodriguez finally stood up from the gallery, understanding that Hayes's statements were implicating him and every other officer who had remained silent about unconstitutional conduct. "Derek, stop talking," Rodriguez said urgently. "You're destroying everyone's career, including your own." Hayes turned toward his former partner with wild eyes. "Carlos, my career was destroyed the moment I put handcuffs on a federal judge. At least now everyone will understand that I wasn't acting alone." The admission confirmed what federal prosecutors suspected. Hayes's misconduct was enabled by supervisors, colleagues, and institutional policies that prioritized aggressive policing over constitutional compliance. Thompson felt the walls closing in as she realized that Hayes's statements would expose her failure to report constitutional violations she had witnessed throughout her career. Her silence hadn't just enabled Hayes. It had helped perpetuate a system that brutalized citizens with impunity. "Officer Hayes," Santos said, "given your statements about departmental policies and supervision, we're expanding our investigation to include potential conspiracy charges against multiple defendants." The word conspiracy sent another shockwave through the courtroom. Hayes's assault on Rachel was no longer being treated as individual misconduct, but as evidence of organized criminal activity within the Atlanta Police Department. Rachel watched the proceedings with mixed emotions. Justice was moving forward with unprecedented speed and scope, but she understood that exposing systemic corruption would be a long, painful process that would affect hundreds of officers and thousands of citizens. "Your Honor," Rachel said, addressing Harrison, "I believe Officer Hayes's statements demonstrate why federal intervention is necessary. His conduct wasn't aberrant, it was systematic." Harrison nodded, recognizing that he had witnessed something that would reshape federal law enforcement accountability. "Judge Montgomery, this court recognizes the extraordinary nature of these proceedings and will ensure all materials are preserved for federal investigation." Hayes slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his angry admissions had not only destroyed his own career, but had triggered a federal investigation that would examine every aspect of Atlanta Police Department operations. "Judge Montgomery," Hayes said quietly, "I hope you understand that this isn't going to end with my arrest. There are officers who will see you as a threat to law enforcement authority. Your safety might be at risk." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Hayes was suggesting that other officers might retaliate against Rachel for exposing departmental misconduct. The comment demonstrated that even facing federal prosecution, he couldn't abandon the intimidation tactics that had defined his career. Rachel met Hayes's gaze with steady eyes. "Officer Hayes, are you threatening a federal judge?" Hayes realized he had just added witness intimidation to his growing list of federal charges. "No, Your Honor. I'm just warning you about reality." Santos stepped forward with handcuffs. "Derek Hayes, you're under arrest for civil rights violations, assault under color of law, perjury, and intimidation of a federal official. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around Hayes's wrists, the same sound that had restrained Rachel 3 hours earlier, the symmetry was complete. The system that had protected his racism for 23 years was finally holding him accountable for his crimes. But Rachel knew that Hayes's arrest was just the beginning. The federal investigation he had triggered with his desperate admissions would expose systemic problems that reached far beyond one racist officer. Sometimes the people who seem most powerful are actually the most fragile when their authority finally gets challenged. The federal courthouse felt different as Rachel walked through its marble corridors at 3:30 p.m., no longer as a victim in handcuffs but as a federal judge reclaiming her authority. The bruises on her face told the story of Hayes's assault, but her steady stride announced that constitutional democracy had survived its test. Federal prosecutors had taken Hayes into custody, but Rachel's day was far from over. She needed to return to her chambers, address the cases that had been delayed by the morning's crisis, and begin the complex process of transforming her personal trauma into systemic reform. Deputy Marshal Williams accompanied her to the judicial elevator, his presence both protective and symbolic. "Judge Montgomery, we've increased security protocols throughout the courthouse. Hayes's threat about officer retaliation is being taken seriously by federal law enforcement." Rachel nodded, understanding that her safety was now a federal concern. "Marshal Williams, I appreciate the protection, but I won't allow intimidation to change how I perform my judicial duties." As the elevator climbed toward the 3rd floor, Rachel reflected on the choice she faced. She could handle Hayes's assault quietly, accepting his prosecution while avoiding the broader confrontation with systemic racism that his case represented. Or she could use her federal judicial authority to demand comprehensive reform of law enforcement practices that had enabled his conduct. The elevator opened to reveal the familiar corridor leading to her chambers. The nameplate that had seemed so distant during her morning assault now welcomed her back to the seat of power Hayes had tried to deny her. But before entering her chambers, Rachel made a decision that would define her judicial legacy. She walked to the courtroom where she normally presided, Courtroom 312, and called her clerk with instructions that would send shockwaves through the federal law enforcement community. "Patricia," Rachel said to her senior clerk, "I need you to schedule an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We're going to address the systematic civil rights violations that led to this morning's incident." Patricia Chen had worked for federal judges for 15 years, but she had never heard of a judge scheduling a hearing about their own assault. "Judge Montgomery, are you certain you want to preside over proceedings related to your own victimization?" Rachel considered the ethical implications carefully. Judicial recusal was normally required when judges had personal involvement in cases, but this situation presented unique constitutional questions about federal judicial authority and law enforcement accountability. "Patricia, I'm not presiding over Officer Hayes's criminal prosecution. That's properly in federal prosecutors' hands. But I am exercising my federal judicial authority to address the systemic violations that enabled his conduct." She handed Patricia a carefully drafted judicial order that would transform Hayes's individual prosecution into a comprehensive examination of law enforcement practices. "Issue this order immediately. I want every Atlanta Police Department supervisor above the rank of sergeant in my courtroom tomorrow morning." Patricia read the order with growing amazement. Rachel was using her federal judicial authority to compel testimony from police officials about departmental policies, training procedures, and supervision practices that had enabled Hayes's misconduct. "Judge Montgomery, this order will create enormous controversy. Police departments aren't accustomed to federal judges directly questioning their operational practices." Rachel's eyes hardened with judicial determination. "Patricia, police departments need to understand that federal judicial authority includes protecting constitutional rights from systematic violation. Tomorrow's hearing will establish that principle clearly. Meanwhile, in federal detention, Hayes was experiencing his first taste of the justice system from the defendant's perspective. His cell was cleaner than the courthouse holding cell where he had imprisoned Rachel, but the psychological impact was devastating. 23 years of law enforcement authority had evaporated, replaced by federal charges that could result in decades in prison. His court-appointed attorney, Marcus Webb, reviewed the case file with growing dismay. Hayes's statements in federal court had provided prosecutors with everything they needed for multiple felony convictions. Worse, his admissions about departmental policies had triggered a federal investigation that would expose systematic constitutional violations. "Derek," Webb said during their initial consultation, "you've created an impossible defense situation. Your statements in court today admitted to every element of the federal charges against you." Hayes stared at the concrete walls of his cell, finally understanding that his racist assumptions had led to complete self-destruction. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. Everything I did today was exactly what the Atlanta Police Department trained me to do." Webb recognized the statement as potential grounds for a defense strategy, but it came with enormous risks. "Derek, if we argue that your conduct was consistent with departmental training, we're essentially accusing the entire police department of systematic civil rights violations." "Good," Hayes said bitterly. "If I'm going down for this, everyone who enabled me should go down too." The statement revealed Hayes's fundamental character flaw. Even facing federal prosecution, he couldn't accept responsibility for his choices without trying to blame others for his conduct. Back in the courthouse, news of Rachel's emergency hearing was spreading through law enforcement and legal communities like wildfire. Atlanta Police Chief Robert Harrison had received the federal judicial order requiring his appearance, and he was struggling to understand its implications. "Legal counsel," Chief Harrison said to Department Attorney Karen Foster, "can a federal judge really compel police officials to testify about departmental policies?" Foster reviewed the judicial order with growing concern. "Chief, Judge Montgomery is exercising federal judicial authority under civil rights statutes. She has the power to investigate systematic constitutional violations, and Hayes's statements today gave her probable cause to believe such violations exist." The police department's worst nightmare was becoming reality. A federal judge with specialized civil rights expertise was preparing to examine decades of policies and practices that had prioritized aggressive policing over constitutional compliance. Captain Morrison, whose name Hayes had specifically mentioned in his courtroom outburst, was meeting with his own attorney to prepare for the next day's testimony. His proactive policing training programs were now subject to federal judicial scrutiny. "Captain," his attorney advised, "anything you say tomorrow can be used in federal criminal proceedings against you. Judge Montgomery isn't conducting a friendly inquiry. She's building a federal case against your department." Morrison felt his career collapsing as he realized that 20 years of supervising officers like Hayes had made him complicit in systematic civil rights violations. His training programs that emphasized racial profiling and aggressive tactics would be exposed to federal examination. Lieutenant Foster and Sergeant Taylor were having similar conversations with their attorneys, understanding that Hayes's desperate admissions had exposed them to federal prosecution. The conspiracy charges that Prosecutor Santos had mentioned weren't theoretical. They were becoming reality as federal investigators examined the connections between individual misconduct and departmental policies. Rodriguez sat in his apartment, staring at his resignation letter while contemplating his limited options. His false witness statement supporting Hayes's fabricated narrative made him vulnerable to perjury charges, but cooperation with federal investigators might provide some protection. His wife Maria found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and newspaper clippings about police accountability cases. "Carlos, what's going to happen to us?" Rodriguez looked up with exhausted eyes. "Maria, I signed a false statement in federal court today. I could go to prison for supporting Derek's lies." Maria had been married to a police officer for 8 years, but she had never imagined that her husband's job could involve federal crimes. "Carlos, why didn't you just tell the truth?" The question cut to the heart of police culture that prioritized loyalty over legality. Rodriguez had been trained to protect fellow officers regardless of their conduct, but that training had led him to commit federal perjury. "Because I was afraid," Rodriguez admitted. "Afraid of challenging a senior officer. Afraid for my career. afraid of being labeled a snitch by other cops. Maria understood that her husband's fear had led him to make choices that could destroy their family. "Carlos, what are you going to do now?" Rodriguez picked up his phone and dialed the number for the U.S. Attorney's office. "I'm going to tell the truth, even if it destroys my career." Thompson was having a similar conversation with her own conscience. Her failure to intervene during a federal judge's assault couldn't be undone, but her cooperation with federal investigators might prevent similar incidents in the future. She drove to the federal courthouse and requested a meeting with Prosecutor Santos, knowing that her statement could be crucial to understanding how good officers remained silent while bad officers brutalized citizens. "Ms. Santos," Thompson said during their evening meeting, "I need to tell you exactly what I witnessed this morning and why I failed to act." Santos recognized Thompson's cooperation as potentially valuable, but she also understood that Thompson's silence had enabled federal crimes. "Officer Thompson, anything you say can be used in proceedings against you, but cooperation could influence how you're charged." Thompson took a deep breath and began describing the institutional pressures that had paralyzed her during Rachel's assault. Her statement would become crucial evidence in the federal pattern and practice investigation. As evening settled over Atlanta, Rachel sat in her chambers reviewing case law about federal judicial authority over law enforcement practices. The legal precedents were clear. Federal judges had broad power to investigate and remedy systematic constitutional violations by state and local officials. But Rachel also understood the personal costs of the path she had chosen. Tomorrow's hearing would make her a target of law enforcement officials who viewed federal oversight as an attack on police authority. Her safety would be at risk, her judicial decisions would face increased scrutiny, and her personal life would never be private again. Patricia knocked on her chamber door with updates about tomorrow's hearing. "Judge Montgomery, the media is requesting access to tomorrow's proceedings. This case is becoming national news." Rachel considered the implications of public attention. Media coverage would increase pressure on police departments to reform their practices, but it would also intensify backlash against her judicial authority. "Patricia, this hearing is about constitutional principles that affect every citizen. The public has a right to understand how systematic police misconduct gets enabled by institutional policies." She signed the media access order, knowing that tomorrow's hearing would be broadcast across the country as an example of federal judicial authority confronting law enforcement abuse. Rachel's phone rang with a call from Chief Judge Patricia Holbrook, her judicial superior who oversaw the Northern District of Georgia. "Rachel, I've been monitoring today's developments. Are you certain you want to preside over tomorrow's hearing?" Rachel understood that her chief judge was offering her an opportunity to step back from the controversy, to let other federal authorities handle the investigation while she focused on healing from her trauma. "Patricia," Rachel replied, "someone needs to use federal judicial authority to address these systematic violations. If I don't do it, who will?" Chief Judge Holbrook recognized the determination in Rachel's voice. "Rachel, you have my full support. Tomorrow's hearing could establish important precedents about federal judicial oversight of law enforcement." As Rachel prepared to leave her chambers, she made one final decision that would define her response to Hayes's assault. She called her judicial secretary with instructions for tomorrow's proceedings. "Tomorrow morning, I want to be robed and ready to preside at exactly 9 a.m. Officer Hayes thought he could determine who belongs in courthouses and who doesn't. Tomorrow, he'll see federal judicial authority in action." Sometimes the most important choice isn't between right and wrong, but between justice and comfort. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Rachel Montgomery entered courtroom 312 wearing her black judicial robes, the same robes that Hayes had claimed she didn't deserve to wear. The purple bruise on her left cheek had darkened overnight, creating a stark contrast against the formal dignity of her federal judicial authority. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Federal prosecutors occupied the front row, flanked by civil rights attorneys who had traveled from across the country to witness this unprecedented hearing. Atlanta police officials sat rigidly in assigned seats, their usual confidence replaced by the nervous energy of people facing federal judicial scrutiny. "All rise," called the bailiff. The Honorable Judge Rachel Montgomery presiding. The irony was intentional and powerful. Less than 24 hours earlier, Hayes had dragged her into a courthouse in handcuffs, calling her an animal who belonged in cages. Now she sat behind the federal bench with absolute authority over the law enforcement officials who had enabled his conduct. "Be seated," Rachel commanded, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with judicial authority that no one could question or dismiss. She looked directly at Hayes, who sat in the defendant's gallery wearing orange federal detention clothing, his hands shackled with the same type of restraints he had used on her. The transformation was complete. The racist officer who had assumed authority over a federal judge now faced decades in prison for his crimes. This hearing addresses systematic violations of constitutional rights that enabled yesterday's assault on federal judicial authority, Rachel announced. "We will examine policies, training, and supervision that created conditions where Officer Hayes believed he could brutalize a federal judge with impunity." Chief Harrison sat in the witness section, his face pale as he contemplated testifying under oath about departmental practices that had prioritized aggressive policing over constitutional compliance. 23 years of covering for officers like Hayes had led to this moment of federal accountability. "Chief Harrison," Rachel called, "approach the witness stand." Harrison walked forward on unsteady legs, understanding that his testimony would either expose systematic misconduct or make him complicit in covering up federal crimes. The oath he took to tell the truth carried the weight of potential perjury charges if he attempted to protect his department. "Chief Harrison, Officer Hayes testified yesterday that his assault on me was consistent with 23 years of departmental training. Was his testimony accurate?" The question forced Harrison to choose between acknowledging systematic civil rights violations or contradicting his own officer's sworn statements. Either answer would devastate his department's legal position. Harrison's attorney had advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights, but refusing to testify would create the appearance of guilt that federal prosecutors could use in criminal proceedings. "Judge Montgomery," Harrison said carefully, "Officer Hayes's conduct yesterday violated every principle of professional law enforcement." Rachel leaned forward, her judicial authority focused on exposing the truth behind decades of misconduct. "Chief Harrison, if Officer Hayes's conduct violated professional principles, how do you explain his 23-year career without serious disciplinary action?" The question struck at the heart of institutional accountability. Hayes hadn't hidden his racist behavior. He had been promoted and commended despite multiple complaints that documented his pattern of constitutional violations. "Judge Montgomery, our internal review processes are designed to balance officer safety with community concerns," Harrison replied, using bureaucratic language to avoid admitting systematic failures. "Chief Harrison, would you please review Exhibit A," Rachel said, gesturing toward a thick folder of documents that federal investigators had compiled overnight. The folder contained Hayes's entire personnel file, including 15 civilian complaints alleging racial bias, excessive force, and false arrests. Each complaint had been investigated by Internal Affairs and dismissed without serious consequences. "Chief Harrison, this file documents 15 separate complaints against Officer Hayes involving racial bias and excessive force. Can you explain why these complaints didn't result in disciplinary action?" Harrison felt sweat beading on his forehead as he reviewed complaints that his department had systematically ignored for over 2 decades. The pattern was undeniable. Hayes had been protected despite clear evidence of racist misconduct. "Judge Montgomery, each complaint was thoroughly investigated according to departmental procedures," Harrison said, knowing that his answer was both technically true and fundamentally misleading. Rachel's eyes blazed with judicial intensity as she prepared to expose the institutional corruption that had enabled Hayes's behavior. "Chief Harrison, would you please review the investigative reports for these complaints and tell the court what pattern emerges?" Harrison reluctantly examined the Internal Affairs reports, each one following an identical formula. Accept officer testimony without question, dismiss civilian witnesses as unreliable, conclude that force was justified based on officer safety concerns. "The investigations appear to follow standard protocols," Harrison said weakly. "Standard protocols that resulted in 0 disciplinary actions despite 15 separate complaints alleging constitutional violations?" Rachel pressed. The question exposed the hollowness of police accountability systems that were designed to protect officers rather than citizens. Harrison's standard protocols had enabled systematic civil rights violations for over 2 decades. Captain Morrison was called next, his proactive policing training programs now subject to federal judicial examination. The training materials that federal investigators had seized revealed explicit instructions to treat black citizens as inherently suspicious. "Captain Morrison," Rachel said, "please explain to the court what proactive policing means in practice." Morrison had spent 20 years developing training programs that emphasized aggressive tactics in black neighborhoods, but explaining those policies under oath would expose him to federal criminal liability. Judge Montgomery, proactive policing involves identifying potential criminal activity before crimes occur, Morrison said, attempting to make racial profiling sound like legitimate law enforcement strategy. Rachel wasn't finished exposing the racist foundations of Morrison's training programs. "Captain Morrison, how does an officer identify potential criminal activity in citizens who are engaged in lawful behavior?" The question forced Morrison to acknowledge that his training programs were based on racial stereotypes rather than legitimate law enforcement criteria. His answer would either expose systematic racism or constitute perjury in federal court. "Officers are trained to recognize behavioral patterns that suggest criminal intent," Morrison replied, still avoiding the explicit racial bias that defined his programs. Rachel gestured toward another exhibit containing Morrison's actual training materials. "Captain Morrison, would you please read slide 47 from your Urban Threat Assessment presentation to the court?" Morrison's face went white as he realized that federal investigators had obtained his training materials that contained explicitly racist content. Slide 47 instructed officers to assume that young black men in groups represented gang activity, regardless of their actual behavior. Those materials were taken out of context," Morrison stammered, understanding that his career in law enforcement was ending in real time. "Captain Morrison, what context makes it appropriate to train officers that race is a legitimate factor in threat assessment?" The question had no acceptable answer. Any context that Morrison could provide would either acknowledge systematic racism or reveal additional constitutional violations. Lieutenant Foster and Sergeant Taylor faced similar examinations, their arrest quotas and racial profiling policies exposed to federal judicial scrutiny. Each supervisor who testified revealed additional layers of institutional racism that had enabled Hayes's assault on federal judicial authority. Rodriguez was called as a witness, his cooperation with federal investigators earning him immunity from perjury charges in exchange for truthful testimony about police culture that prioritized loyalty over legality. "Officer Rodriguez," Rachel said, "you signed a false witness statement supporting Officer Hayes's fabricated narrative. Please explain to the court why you chose to commit perjury in federal proceedings." Rodriguez had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, understanding that his testimony could expose the cultural pressures that corrupted good officers. "Judge Montgomery, I was afraid," Rodriguez said simply. "Afraid of challenging a senior officer. Afraid of being labeled a snitch. Afraid that telling the truth would end my career." Rachel nodded, recognizing that Rodriguez's fear was evidence of institutional problems that extended far beyond individual misconduct. "Officer Rodriguez, was your fear justified based on departmental culture?" "Yes, Your Honor. Officers who challenge misconduct face retaliation, isolation, and career destruction. The department protects officers who stay silent and punishes those who speak up." The admission confirmed what federal investigators suspected: systematic corruption that protected bad officers while intimidating good ones into silence. Thompson testified next, her failure to intervene during a federal judge's assault serving as evidence of how institutional pressures paralyzed officers who witnessed misconduct. "Officer Thompson," Rachel said, "you witnessed Officer Hayes's unprovoked assault on me but failed to intervene. Please explain your decision." Thompson had prepared for this question, understanding that her honesty might provide grounds for reform while her continued silence would make her complicit in ongoing violations. "Judge Montgomery, I was taught that challenging senior officers was insubordination. I was afraid that intervening would destroy my career and accomplish nothing except making me a target." Rachel leaned back in her judicial chair, processing testimony that revealed systematic corruption extending throughout the Atlanta Police Department. Individual accountability was important, but institutional reform required addressing the cultural problems that enabled widespread misconduct. The testimony presented today reveals systematic violations of constitutional rights that cannot be addressed through individual prosecutions alone, Rachel announced to the packed courtroom. She gestured toward Hayes, who sat in shackles listening to his colleagues expose the institutional racism he had represented. Officer Hayes's assault on federal judicial authority was not an isolated incident of individual misconduct. It was the predictable result of policies, training, and supervision that prioritized aggressive policing over constitutional compliance. Rachel's voice carried across the courtroom with the full weight of federal judicial authority as she announced her ruling. Therefore, this court is issuing a comprehensive federal consent decree requiring immediate reforms to Atlanta Police Department policies, training, supervision, and accountability mechanisms. The consent decree was unprecedented in its scope, requiring federal oversight of every aspect of police operations until constitutional compliance could be guaranteed. Training programs would be rewritten, supervision protocols would be restructured, and accountability systems would be redesigned to protect citizens rather than officers. Furthermore, Rachel continued, this court is referring all supervisory officials who testified today to federal prosecutors for investigation of potential conspiracy charges related to systematic civil rights violations. The announcement sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Rachel was using her federal judicial authority to hold accountable not just Hayes, but everyone who had enabled his misconduct through policies, training, and willful ignorance. Hayes listened to his destruction with a mixture of despair and grudging recognition. The federal judge he had brutalized was systematically dismantling the corrupt system that had protected his racism for 23 years. Officer Hayes, Rachel said, addressing him directly, you will face federal prosecution for assault under color of law, civil rights violations, perjury, and intimidation of a federal official. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the penalties are severe. She paused, looking at the man who had called her an animal and claimed she belonged in cages rather than courthouses. But your individual prosecution is less important than the systematic reforms your conduct has made necessary. Rachel stood from behind the federal bench, her judicial robes symbolizing the constitutional authority that Hayes had tried to deny her. This hearing demonstrates that federal judicial power can and will be used to protect constitutional rights from systematic violation by state and local officials. The gavel fell with finality, but the sound echoed far beyond courtroom 312. News cameras captured the moment when a federal judge who had been brutalized by racist police violence used her judicial authority to demand comprehensive reform. Hayes was led away in shackles, his 23-year career ending in federal detention while facing decades in prison. The racist assumptions that had led him to assault a federal judge had ultimately destroyed everything he had built. 6 months later, Officer Derek Hayes was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The Atlanta Police Department operated under federal oversight, its policies rewritten to prioritize constitutional compliance over aggressive tactics. Rachel continued serving as a federal judge, her bruises healed but her commitment to constitutional justice strengthened by her experience on both sides of the courtroom. The nameplate outside her chambers still read, "The Honorable Judge R. Montgomery, presiding," but now it carried additional meaning as a symbol of federal judicial authority that no racist officer could ever challenge again. Real justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about changing systems that create the conditions for guilt to flourish. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.